Hello, I'm Rick Sinding. It's Thursday, July 11th, 2019, here at the Eagleton Institute of Politics on the campus of Rutgers University. With us today for the Center on the American Governor is Ken Zimmerman, who has a long and very interesting career in law, government, social justice, academia, and a whole bunch of other things that we could go on and on talking about. But for our purposes here today, we're going to try to focus as much as we can on the 3 years that he spent between 2006 and 2008 as the chief counsel to New Jersey's 45th governor, John Corzine. Ken Zimmerman, welcome to Eagleton.
Pleasure to be here.
So let's talk about your early days. Where did you grow up? I know that you went to Harvard and to Yale and Harvard Law School, but where were you before there?
So I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I'm very proudly a D.C. native, and I need to be absolutely clear. I grew up inside D.C., not in the suburbs, one or the other. But it's interesting, and actually I think it probably influenced what I went on to do, in that my parents, when they bought a home, the neighborhood they were looking for was on the wrong side of Rock Creek Park for most of the white folks, and it was a neighborhood that still had restrictive covenants that prevented Jews and African Americans from buying in that neighborhood.
Is this Northwest?
It is, in Northwest, but in a neighborhood called Crestwood, which is on the east side of Rock Creek Park. And the realtor decided it was better to sell to Jews than to blacks, and within a year the neighborhood was integrated. And it turned out to be one of the few integrated neighborhoods in Washington, D.C., and so that's where I grew up until I went off to New Haven to go to college.
Were your parents involved politically?
They weren't. It's one of the strangest things that...
there are people in that company town who don't belong to the company?
My dad was a lawyer, but was non-political. My mom ended up being a travel agent, but she was a volunteer for the League of Women Voters. So I remember more calendars in our basement that she would go off to sell than anything. But it was an astonishing thing. I grew up in the 60s and 70s in D.C., and I could have been in Toledo, Ohio for all of the significance of what was going on just several miles away down on the mall.
And were you a public school kid or a private school
kid? So I started in public school, and I went there through elementary school or thereabouts. And it was at the time when they started desegregating the schools. While many of the families we knew moved to the suburbs, my folks decided to stay put and moved me to private schools. So I ended up going to St. Albans, one of the private schools in the area.
Which is kind of a feeder school for Yale, isn't it?
Well, feeder school for Yale, it exposed me to politicians for the first time. Because many of the politicians' kids, so I went to school with Mondale's kid and several of the Kennedys. Jeb Magruder's kid was there, interestingly enough. So it was...
was this during Watergate?
During Watergate.
Wow.
So,
that had to be very interesting.
These were kids I knew, and I came from, sort of a middle-class family without any of this exposure, but it was a fascinating way to realize, okay, not only did they, have two legs, but there was a lot more behind the surface of any of these politicians than met the eye on television and the like.
So you went off to Yale.
Went off to Yale.
Were you already reasonably certain that you wanted to go into law?
I thought that was the likely default. I fond enough of arguing that it seemed to be a place in which one could pursue that. But actually, what influenced me ultimately to go to law school was an experience I had after I graduated. I spent a couple years before going back to school trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I was working for a community organizing group. I was actually...
This is between undergraduate and...
Exactly. I spent a couple years. I finished. My first job out of college was canvassing, knocking on doors to raise money for a public interest organization. I did that as a living for 6 or 8 months, and I've concluded that actually, as a law school course, they should force people to do that because it forces you to be pithy. It actually persuasive to get in the door in New England. That was a valuable thing to be able to do.
Were you in New Haven?
I was in Connecticut doing it through the winter. But I remember going to the State House about an environmental issue, making some policy pitch. They said the lawyers will resolve that. That's where the answer is going to be. And I decided that I really wanted to be involved, in the words of Hamilton, in the room where it happens.
Where it happens.
And so that's really ultimately what, I had a sense that might be what I would do, but that's what led me to apply.
But always with the idea being that you would be in public interest law?
Absolutely. I mean, in part growing up in D.C. influenced me in a couple of interesting ways. One is it made me really interested in state and local government. I mean, the absence of representation in the District of Columbia was something that I felt. I mean, D.C. is the last colony, is what the license plates say. And so very interestingly, I wanted to understand what that felt like, and felt very clearly the absence of local government meant that any talented people who wanted to serve were going to go elsewhere, because there was not that path in D.C. To do it. So, I was interested in cities. I was interested in social justice, and I was interested in the way in which you solve problems. Ultimately, in addition to law school, I spent a year in urban planning school at MIT, and one of the memories I have is the guy who headed the NTA coming in and saying, I've got two of the most challenging experiences that occur every single day I need to resolve, morning and evening rush hour. And I've always believed that that's actually the best of government, is that you're taking on the most complicated and challenging things. And in the context of urban environments, that's what I was naturally drawn to.
So from law school, in law school, was there a particular subject area that you specialized in, or is Harvard Law just runs the gamut?
It was interesting because I spent this year at urban planning school, and I went to urban planning school at MIT. I thought I always asked the really interesting questions.
Is this while you were at Harvard?
Yeah, it was a 4-year program. I never wrote my thesis for the MIT portion, which is why it's not on any of the resumes or the like. But MIT, the urban planners asked all the interesting questions. How do you promote equity within a housing program? Where does capital come from that you're trying to put into, inner city communities? But I never thought they gave you the tools to answer them. And that meant that you had to be equipped with something that could actually make a difference. And so that's what, for me, law school really provided. I spent a lot of time at the Harvard Legal Aid Bureau. I think I overlap with Michelle Obama, even though I didn't know her there. I took a lot of courses on poverty law and housing and criminal law, constitutional law, and the like.
Probably didn't know her because she was Michelle Robinson at the time.
Among other things. I suspect that was one of many reasons.
You graduated from Harvard Law and got what's referred to as a Skadden Fellowship.
I did. I spent a year clerking for a federal judge in San Francisco first, but yes, then I got a Skadden Fellowship.
And why? I mean, you grew up in Washington, went to college in New Haven, went to law school in Cambridge, and then all the way across the country.
So, I applied for clerkships in 4 places: Boston, D.C., San Francisco, and Seattle. I've always loved the West Coast. I love the outdoors. And the clerkship that I got was in San Francisco, and it was with a great judge who had been the chief judge of the Northern District, and had been involved.
This is U.S. District Court.
Correct, Robert Peckham. So U.S. District Court gave me insight into consent decrees overseeing the San Francisco Fire Department and its employment practices. We were engaged in providing land claims to the island of Guam when the U.S. took it over during World War II. And, San Francisco, especially at that time, was just a fantastic place to live. And yes, I applied then. It was the very first year of the Skadden Fellowships. It's now 30 years old. I recently participated in the celebration of it, but the firm, really led by its managing partner, wanted to give back, since the firm is not known as a public interest center, and they put aside money for these fellowships, 25 of us. And I was interested in housing and homelessness, as I mentioned, and in Oakland worked with the local legal services center to create what I thought would be a new model program that would bring together social services and legal services to address the problems of homelessness, and then was immediately diverted when 4 days after I started, the Loma Prieta earthquake hit.
Oh my.
And so it turned out, I had no clients at that point, and so they just turned me to say, figure out what happened to the low-income clients that we were serving. And, it was a really horrific thing, especially as somebody from the East Coast. I'm used to the soil not going anywhere, and it was a really eye-opening experience.
And were you trying to find housing for these people, or trying to relocate them, or how?
Well, the first thing we did is just try to figure out what had happened to them. I mean, it took us a week to get back into our offices, but it became pretty clear that what was happening is that the numbers of homeless people had significantly expanded.
Oh, this was the earthquake that canceled the World Series,
Absolutely.
Right? Okay, all right.
And
that was a big one.
Downtown Oakland, downtown San Francisco, farm worker country. Mm-hmm. To make a long story short, within a month, we put together a report that indicated that at that point, FEMA's disaster relief was really predicated on floods in Iowa and for a middle-class population. Mm-hmm. And they were entirely ill-equipped to deal with the urban poor. So as an example, they had a policy, I think it was administrative convenience, that only one person in a household could get housing assistance to find new housing. Makes sense if you're talking about a middle-class population. But in San Francisco and Oakland, you had people on SSI, on disability, that were doubling or tripling up. They didn't know each other. It was the only way they could afford a room in an SRO. So the policy, while not particularly malevolent, had huge consequences that actually deprived people who needed the resources from getting it. And there were a whole host of other things. We wrote a report within a month. I had never done a press conference before. We did a press conference. It was covered in the national news. My parents were very happy to see me in the Washington Post and on NPR. And, aside from being an early purveyor of bad news, which I think became a career, something I extended, it was actually something that bringing together local government and state government to realize what the federal government should do was enormously powerful. We ended up with a political constituency that forced FEMA to the table.
And did FEMA react?
Within a month, we had a $23 million settlement, and then litigated the settlement for the next year.
Did FEMA change its policies?
It did, absolutely. I mean, it was for a young lawyer, just on a personal, it was an amazing experience. I was with more experienced folks. We had a private firm, but it showed me the power of what firsthand experience did. There's nothing like being in touch with people who, are suffering as a means of communicating to government about what needs to happen. And so, it's also good television and all the rest, but it was a very powerful way to both organize government and the rest, and to start the process of figuring out what you need to do to rebuild and recover.
You went from there back to your hometown.
I did. As is usual, usually the case, there's a woman involved. My then girlfriend, now wife, had followed me out to San Francisco. She wanted to move back to the East Coast and got a job at the Public Defender Service in Washington, D.C., which is a very elite organization. So I then transferred my Skadden to go to the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless, which is where I spent my second year.
And that was, I see, and you could actually take your fellowship with you.
They allowed me. You weren't really supposed to, but that's what I did.
And was this legal clinic very similar to the work that you had been doing in San Francisco?
Essence,
without the earthquake.
Exactly. All the earthquakes were human created at that point in time.
But homelessness was a significant issue in Washington at the time.
It was.
Well, still is.
Unfortunately, it still is. Yeah. And we undertook a case to sue the D.C. Housing Authority and a variety of other things along the way. I remember, as one of my fond early experiences, representing some homeless people in D.C. had tried to address panhandlers by adopting an anti-loitering ordinance, which a lot of municipalities did, and we got a guy who said he'd be willing to challenge it. We thought it was unconstitutional, and so went into the equivalent of municipal court. Said, Judge, we have a constitutional claim that we'd like to make. Expecting that the judge would be shocked, and said, we've got a First Amendment claim. Judge turned to us and said, we've been waiting for you, but I think you've got a Fifth Amendment claim as well. And it was a really good early indicator to be somewhat humble about one's own expertise and coming into situations like that.
So you spent the earliest part of your career afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted.
Indeed.
But then you went to government.
I did.
How did that come about?
Well, so I'd spent the 2 years doing legal services work effectively. And there were two things. One, I realized that I'd had a remarkably elevated experience. I mean, I was effectively serving as a partner, but I had not done the nuts and bolts of litigation. And I wanted to do that. I wanted to take the depositions, learn how interrogatories work. It's frightening to say that as a lawyer at this point in my career, but and I was fortunate. I'd received an offer from the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department previously, and as somebody who grew up with that as the image of those who were riding to the rescue, I was fortunate enough to get an offer to go back to the Civil Rights Division as a baby lawyer at that point. And that's where I spent the next 6 or 7 years of my career.
Now, this was the Civil Rights Division and Housing and Civil Enforcement
Correct.
Section.
Yes.
This is a very specific section dealing primarily with homelessness and housing and
less housing.
Okay.
So, the way the Civil Rights Division is set up, from the days when it was created by Nick Katzenbach and others, John Doerr, in the late 60s, the belief was that civil rights cases need to be done out of D.C. because local politics always get in the way of the kind of enforcement that you want. And over the years, as it had been built up, they had developed and sort of created separate sections that had subject matter expertise in various areas: employment, voting, criminal, and one of them was housing and civil enforcement. So the primary statute that we enforced was the Fair Housing Act.
Right.
There were several others, Title II of the Civil Rights Act, Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, Fair Credit Reporting Act, that we had some responsibility, but the Fair Housing Act was the primary one.
And you're looking principally at individual or corporate landlords, or you're looking at HUD or both?
Well, we weren't looking at HUD. HUD was supposed to be an ally of ours. The supposed to is a fairly important phrase there, but there were really 3 different types of cases that we had. We had cases against apartment owners who discriminated. Race was one of the largest categories, but disability, families with children were also protected. And interestingly, one of the things that we established was the first ever national testing program, where literally we would have people, you would give them false identities. So you'd have a white person go in, that person would be treated in a certain way, and then you'd have an African American go in. If they were treated differently, that was evidence of discrimination. And so based upon that, I had a case in Florida, I think it was the first $1 million settlement against an apartment complex where the evidence from the testing established that they were, as they say, providing a revolving door instead of a slam door, but they were politely turning away the African Americans, then immediately thereafter giving the white.
Very interesting. In the years that I was working for the Bergen Record, we did exactly the same thing.
Yep.
Sent out 2 black reporters posing as husband and wife, and 2 white reporters posing as husband and wife, and went around looking for real estate in the Bergen County area.
Yep.
And found redlining going on all over the place.
Just as an aside, it's still one of the most remarkable cases. I got a call from several assistant United States attorneys who'd been at a conference in New Orleans. They decided they wanted to hear some Zydeco music, and so went out near Lafayette, Louisiana, and they had an African American white, 2 whites, and you can tell where this is going, but African American woman goes in to see if they're open, is told no, it's a private club. She goes back, she says it's suspicious, sends her friend who's white in, they of course say for $5 you can get in. This particular statute requires, though, 2 incidents to bring a case.
So you have the other one going.
Well, no, we got the FBI. So if we needed outside investigators, the FBI were at our disposal. Normally we didn't use them. But for a while I was the most popular attorney in the entire Justice Department because I was sending the FBI out to nightclubs to assess discrimination. But when an exact same thing happened, the FBI is wired, and this is the classic open and shut case. At any rate, one type of case was about this clear-cut individual discrimination, and it still exists, unfortunately, but those cases are fairly easy to understand. The second were really against local governments. This is exclusionary zoning, other practices in which local governments were really opposing the creation or development of affordable housing or supportive housing for people with disabilities. And the law has a theory under the disparate impact standard that allows those types of cases to be brought. And that was a way of addressing the kind of restrictive practices local government has. It was very useful when I came to New Jersey and Mount Laurel.
Exactly.
And litigated some of that along the way. And then the third area, which became increasingly important while I was there, was really looking at banks, finance companies, and mortgage companies. It was just the first period of time where data was becoming available that allowed you to assess whether the criteria used to give people mortgages were being used in problematic ways. And over the course of the 7 or 8 years, we were really in the forefront of beginning to bring cases that helped understand what the modern manifestation of redlining was like.
Now you went from being a trial attorney then to being the senior trial attorney.
I gather that sounds right.
And then you went, literally across the street, I guess, as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Enforcement and Programs in HUD's Office of Fair Housing.
Right.
So now instead of being the litigator, you're the administrator.
Right. So. The 6 or 7 years, I loved this work. Deval Patrick was my boss for a good portion of the time, somebody I respect enormously, and I went to go work for Andrew Cuomo. So my experience of working with people who would go on to become governor was well established at this point. I really loved the litigation. There's nothing better. The Civil Rights Division is a very, very special place when you have an administration committed to civil rights. At the same time, by the end of my 6 or 7 years there, the case that really led me to believe I was ready to go do something else was a case I brought against a bank on the outskirts of the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. And this guy refused to make secured loans on the reservation. And, we did research, and ultimately the guy was a racist, and we brought a case against him. But in the course of the 6 or 8 months of investigation, it became abundantly clear to me that there were multiple reasons why people would not make loans on the reservation. They didn't use the Uniform Commercial Code. They didn't have legally trained judges. So that, if somebody were not a racist and really wanted to bring capital to that reservation, there were real barriers. And litigation was not going to be what would solve it.
Regulation would.
Regulation would, programs would. There were multiple other things that were needed, regulation, but government resources could actually make a difference. And so, as I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next, I was fortunate enough to get this offer. And I also realized I wanted to understand how government worked. I was moving from a Tier A agency. The Department of Justice is top flight in terms of what it does, who's there.
But it's truly, it's supposed to be truly independent.
Absolutely.
As opposed to other cabinet offices, which are more reflective of the position of the president and the administration.
Which is interesting when we get back to the Corzine stuff. Some of my relationships with Stu and Ann, who were attorney generals.
It would be Stu Rabner and
Milgram. And I was chief counsel. Actually, my image of what a government lawyer was the Justice Department. And it was very interesting all of a sudden going to the client side, which is effectively what I did when I went to HUD. So I went to HUD, I was there for a couple of years, and this position, it's fairly senior. I had a flag in my office, which is how my stepfather always measured if you were in government with enough pull. But we...
And this is 1998, so did you also have a picture of George H.W. Bush on the wall behind you?
No, this is Clinton 2, 98.
1990. Oh, I have this wrong. I have the dates wrong on that.
Yeah, so this is...
Okay.
I was in the Justice Department. I started the Justice Department in 1991. So Bush, actually, I joined the Bush administration as a baby lawyer, but I was there through Clinton 1, halfway into Clinton 2.
98, of course.
And then, so this is actually, Clinton's getting impeached. There was the initiative on race, which I had some involvement with, that was largely undermined by Clinton's problems.
The last year and a half was difficult.
Yeah, but this was a time where working for Andrew Cuomo was fascinating. He was willing to put a lot of his political capital into being very aggressive in civil rights issues. We had money to give out to grants to try to make a difference about educating people about what should happen. And it was also a complicated place. The Civil Rights Office, which is where I was the second or third in command, had very tense relationships with other parts of the agency. And it was a real learning experience about what I'd always been curious about, which is what stops government when it's supposed to have a mission that feels like it should be fairly easy to perform from accomplishing it.
And what did you find?
Well, I concluded that there's always reasons for something, and I think that one understands why the press covers what the outcome of the sausage is, but the sausage making is where really one understands what the potential and the barriers are. And actually, it informed very much what I did next.
Yes, which is what I'm most interested in, I have to tell you.
Well, it was one of these, in terms of failing career planning, which is what I do believe I represent. So I'd been there for a couple of years, fairly high-ranking position, but it was national in scope, and so I was traveling. I had 3 small kids at the time, and a headhunter found me and asked if I'd be interested in becoming the founding executive director of the Newark-based New Jersey Institute for Social Justice.
And who were the people who were behind that?
It was just a wonderful group. Alan Lowenstein, who you will remember, the founder of the Lowenstein-Sandler law firm, was really the mover and shaker. I mean, he was born and raised in Newark. He had done well, not only with the law firm, but with some private investments, wanted to give back, believed in Newark, believed in the opportunity it had given him, believed that Newark wasn't living up to its potential and that there were barriers that prevented that. He brought together just a tremendous board. Nick Katzenbach, the former U.S. Attorney General, was my board chair. Ted Wells, Judge Debevoise, Doug Eakley, Zulema Farber.
All the usual suspects.
Bob Curvin, Richard Roper, people you will know well and remember well. Were the board, and they had spent a couple of years getting together. Ted Wells spent a couple of years getting together, trying to figure out what they should do, and ultimately, I think, made the right choice.
Was Gus Henningberg?
Gus wasn't on the board, but Gus was one of the 2 people that Alan told me I should go see first. It was just great. They decided they needed an executive director. I mean, all the good talking wasn't going to lead them until there was somebody responsible for making something happen. I'll say this humorously, but they made the natural choice to hire a white Jewish guy who had never set foot in Newark to be the founding executive director of this place. Some would say that was a curious decision, but I feel very honored that they selected me. And in all honesty, I think my national experience was something. They had ambition to be nationally significant. And ultimately, I think they concluded that having somebody who didn't have a history in Newark or in New Jersey was an advantage. It meant that you had to operate very, very carefully, as you well know.
Well, you came without baggage.
Absolutely.
You may have accumulated some during the course of these years.
Absolutely.
What was the situation in Newark at the time? Who was the mayor? Was it Sharp James?
Sharp James was absolutely the mayor.
Okay.
And one of the great advantages of having a board like this is I told them from the get-go that if what they wanted were headlines immediately, I wasn't going to be providing that. If they really wanted to make change, it meant I had to listen a lot to people. Sharp James was the mayor. The same challenges of a city that is proud, that has many assets, but also many challenges, in which downtown development was being prioritized, the neighborhoods felt left out, in which the suburban power of the state, despite the fact that Sharp had both the mayor and the state Senate seat, was there.
And Ron Rice, I think, was on the council and also in the legislature.
Absolutely. So, the politics of Newark were everything that they have lived up to be. Interestingly, the organization, the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, had previously hired this law student named Cory Booker, you may have heard of, to write the first white paper for it. So, I think he was already in town. I can't remember if he was on the council while I was there, but they had found him somewhere along the way and he had written this paper. But, You know, it was at a time when one could see the potential of Newark. You know, we ended up with offices in Military Park. And it's amazing going back there now, as you well know.
It's now becoming a prestigious address.
But you could look across the street at the Haynes Building, you know, and Alan would take me by and describe what the Haynes Building looked like, you know, the intersection of Broad and Raymond, and, you know, going shopping there with his parents. He talked, I mean, he was a wonderful man who became a mentor, about his grandmother seeing Abe Lincoln on the courthouse, you know, and just very powerful stuff. And there was something about that image of caring about Newark as a place of opportunity for people that was incredibly compelling. I mean, I was somebody who cared about cities and believed they offered that opportunity. But it was also, I remember going to my first city council meeting, you know, and it's the same thing. The building was falling apart. You know, the Renaissance Mall had been started and then abandoned, which I thought was symbolic of Newark, if anything was. And so, you know, it was a time where the city was still very poor. There was no real hope to it when it was referred to, as I'm sure you'll remember, on national newscasts. It was all about what had happened, 40 years previous.
Ken Gibson said, wherever American cities are going, Newark will get there first.
Absolutely.
And I think everybody sort of accepted that as a fact. But tell me what you did at tell me two things. First of all, where did the money come from to set up the Institute? Was it Alan Lowenstein, or did you have a responsibility to go out and raise money as well?
So it was a really remarkable act of philanthropy. He committed 5 years of funding at a nice level, $500,000 a year. And he said... That
was real money back in those days.
It was real money, but he said, look, your expectation is that you are going to raise beyond that. And by the time I left, we were about $3 million a year. So raised a bunch of money from local foundations and that ultimately national foundations and individuals. But that was the starting point. But he said, if you do that for 5 years, and we think that you've accomplished it, we will actually endow this with money that he had set aside. So there was $8 to $10 million he had set aside, and it was the equivalent of the Institute's tenure decision. If you make it 5 years, the family thinks it's on the right track, then you will have an endowment, which for a nonprofit is a remarkable thing. And
had you known any of the people involved in the Institute before you came here?
None. It was truly a step into the unknown. And as you can tell, I feel deeply grateful to Alan for the opportunity. I grew, to really like and respect all of them. I mean, the opportunity to talk to Nick Katzenbach on a regular basis for a lawyer or for somebody interested in government. I mean, to hear stories about Robert Kennedy and LBJ, go to his house and see the photos on the wall was a remarkable thing. Bob Kervin and Richard Roper were people I just really depended upon and grew very, very fond of. And as tour guides to Newark, those were really, really good ones. But in terms of what we did, I had to make choices, both hiring staff and starting to create a track record. And, you know, I mentioned that coming out of government, which is really all I had done beforehand, I had a couple of things that guided me. One is that there were many, many people in government who wanted to do good, but were constrained either because the politics didn't allow them to do things that if other people took on the politics would allow them to do it, or they didn't have the information that could actually substantiate a new policy, or they weren't close enough to people and couldn't get close enough to people to really understand what kind of issues they could address. And that seemed to me to be a really wise or interesting way to take on doing stuff in Newark.
To bring that information to the attention of people who could make a difference?
In part, but to even go a step further. So to give an example, I mean, we ended up with work in 3 different areas. One was in criminal justice reform. One was what we called regional equity, which was really sort of housing and regional concerns. And the third was in employment. So to take the employment work first. It was at a time that I'm sure you'll remember where the Supreme Court in Abbott had just issued its school construction program, construction decision. So $8.6 billion of school construction now being ordered. And the question was, and it was very clear to anybody who was paying attention, that who was going to get those jobs were going to become politically significant. And once you did a bit of research, you knew 2 things. People in Newark were going to demand those jobs, as they should, since $1 billion of the school construction was going to take place there. And the people who really controlled the jobs, of course, were the building trades, right? I mean, you don't need to be a rocket scientist, you've been around. And you also knew that most of the building trades were still under consent decrees for civil rights violations and had no relationship with anybody there, and in fact thought all the community activists wanted to do was to beat up on them. It seemed to us, and this was sort of the gamble we made, that if somebody on the outside who could take the political risk of bringing together the building trades, community activists, and the Newark public schools to say, we'll take on the risk of what it means for each of you to deal with each other if you approach us in good faith. Building trades actually tell us when the tests you offer are going to be held, and just inform us. But also tell us what you really need. And over time, we developed a relationship where they said, look, don't worry about them, how well they do a hammer. Are they drug-free, math, educated, and know what a union is? I said, okay, that sounds good. Vocational school, can you provide a program that would allow us to figure out who can show up on time and meet those other criteria? Newark activists, if we get those commitments, would you be willing to support a program that would actually take recent Newark High School graduates, many of whom aren't going to college, put them into such a program without a guarantee, but with an expectation that if they do this, they'll get in? Now that's a risky thing for, as you know, I always joke that, it was the first time that we had knee pads or other protective gear in a budget for anything like this. But it took a year or two of relationship development, but we actually created that program. We got over 400 black and brown Newark residents union cards. Unions ended up believing in the program because we lived up to what we said we were going to do, and then ultimately the state invested $30 million to replicate it. So that was sort of a model of social change that we were able to take on. And we did that in a number of other, we were very active in the, you may remember the subprime lending crisis. Where we issued the report, and then with AARP, with Phyllis A. Lokay and others, I ended up drafting a good portion of the legislation that ultimately got established, and a variety of initiatives, but they were all predicated on good data, sound evidence, on understanding the politics well enough so that one understood how one could manage the various influencers, but then ultimately were solution-oriented for the community that we were trying to serve.
Now, was that community specifically Newark, or did it begin to have a statewide mandate?
Great question. So we started in Newark, but pretty soon it became clear that our interest was in urban New Jersey, and more broadly and frequently low income and New Jerseyans and New Jerseyans of color.
And did you have similar efforts or programs in other urban areas?
Well,
I mean, I remember, for example, that the Fund for New Jersey undertook a significant urban initiative in Camden. And I wonder whether you
So we wouldn't run programs in Camden when I was at the Institute, but we would support them. So for example, when we had our pre-apprenticeship program, a program was established like that in Camden. We provided all the support, technical assistance for that to happen. The way in which we got involved in these other urban communities was more on the policy level. So, for example, the subprime lending crisis was emerging, as exploitative brokers and bankers were taking advantage. The coalition was with the NAACP or the Hispanic Caucus, and those represented urban communities throughout New Jersey. And as we ended up increasingly focusing on state policy, since that's where you could make change, it was important to have relationships throughout. So increasingly we took those kinds of steps.
And how much would you say this job introduced you to the political landscape of New Jersey?
Absolutely. I threw it, Mark Murphy at the Fund for New Jersey was actually on my board, and he became a close friend. And, on some level, there were ways in which we were almost the operating arm of the Fund for New Jersey over time. You can tell there was a similarity in interest. Absolutely. But I knew nothing about the politics of New Jersey. And again, in part because I had no baggage, I was able to come and introduce myself based on the substance of what we were doing, which was a fairly unusual and fortunate way to be able to introduce myself.
But in those 7 years, you certainly became known to people in the in the field. You weren't litigating, though, were you?
We did not litigate in our own name, but we participated as amicus in a variety of things. But no, intentionally concluded that litigation, I mean, partly it took too much resources, and there were others like the ACLU or David Chiara and others doing the litigation. Right. But that we were better served by introducing things, sometimes through litigation. We wrote reports that were used in litigation, but for much of the theory of the case, of bringing people together, litigation, as my experience had shown me, was a pretty blunt tool that was not likely to be able to build the constituency that one needed.
When did you first meet John Corzine?
So I first met him during the campaign. I had no...
His campaign for governor?
For his campaign for governor. I may have met him, actually that's not, I had met him just as one would, but I've got this great photograph of this pre-apprenticeship program. We took a photo on the steps of Newark City Hall, and I think at that point, both of the senators, Corzine and
who was it? Who
Laudenberg.
Was Laudenberg.
The two senators and I think, were the only white faces in the picture, so it was fairly easy to make out. So I'd met him just in the course of going, but I didn't really have a relationship with him. My relationship started really, during the campaign. They, as frequently occurs, came to us for advice on a variety of issues and asked us for input on a variety of things.
So you had a sufficient standing at that point so that somebody in that campaign cared about what you thought.
I think we both had standing, and we had a board that had standing.
Had some clout.
So,
okay.
If you have Salim on the board, or Ted Wells on the board, or Richard Roper on the board, you're part of policy, elite, if you will, right. That made sense. But it was really, in the course of that, I met him, but when he got elected in the transition period, I remember Dick Leone, who was running his transition committee, reaching out to me, and ultimately we settled on my running or co-chairing the criminal justice committee. Those types of roles are ones where, in part, they're designed to develop policy, but there is much to figure out who might be part of a team that you want to bring aboard.
And that was a really unusual transition, because it was not from one party to another. It was within the party.
Right.
There were some hard feelings, I would say, between Governor Cody and the incoming folks in the who were going to make up the Corzine administration. But from what I understand, the Corzine transition functioned as it would have regardless of which party was involved. So you're looking, for example, of criminal justice, maybe you're looking for a corrections commissioner, and it may be a new person, or it may be the holdover,
right.
and that sort of thing.
It was interesting. I mean, I subsequently participated in the Obama transition in 2008, and I have to say that the Corzine transition resembled it in a way. And it did so, I mean, other transitions that I've been around have been very political. I mean, they're essentially job hunts, either for the incoming people or for the people who are participating in it. This one was so much more serious about the policy. I mean, the rest of the stuff was always there, right? But they were really interested if there were policy ideas that were politically saleable enough, and deep respect for whatever might emerge.
That had to be Dick Leone's influence.
Oh, absolutely. No, this,
no question about it.
This is Dick Leone. And I came from that side. Since then,
had you known Leone before this, or
I hadn't, but I'd been. I mean, he's close to Richard Roper and others. So it was, I have to say, one of the things about coming to New Jersey that was astonishing was just how small a place it was, and that especially in the kind of world I was entering, I used to joke that we would take interns on the tour of the public interest groups, and then we'd go out for lunch. It didn't take a lot, and
well, especially those that are involved in sort of broad public policy.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. So you're sitting there, and you're still at the Institute. You participated in this transition. What then? I mean, were you sitting around waiting to be asked to do something? Did you figure I'll give my opinions and then come what may?
I was very, very happy at the Institute. I mean, it felt like a job. I had built the organization. We were starting to make national impact. We were, it's the kind of job one, really thinks about having for 10 years to build up something like that. And I had sent signals that I wasn't particularly interested in something. I was never going to say no. I'm not that stupid. But and I remember, early on, sitting. I was in a room. They'd asked Corzine and Leone had asked me to come down, and in a room where they asked me to come in, and we had this conversation that was just beyond surreal, because I can't figure out why I'm there, and I assume there's something about a job, but
they're probably sizing you up. Huh?
And eventually, I remember Dick saying, or John saying to Dick, "Does Ken know why he's here?" I said, "No, I don't." And eventually, they were. Asked me about whether I might be interested in a job, and I took it really seriously, but concluded that I'd live in Montclair, my kids were still at home, and that the particular job just wasn't of the one that I really wanted to give up the Institute for. So I said no. I said I'd be happy to help in whatever way I can. Really not expecting that 8 months later they would come back to me.
Well, Stu Rabner was the governor's first chief counsel.
Exactly.
And within 5 months, 6 months, the Attorney General, Zulema Farber, resigned as Attorney General. He was named Attorney General, and Chief Counsel became available, and then that was offered to you?
Exactly.
Okay. And that was worth leaving the Institute for?
It was. I'm a public service guy, and it's a remarkable position. And I should say, I have deep respect for John. I just thought, he was clearly policy-oriented. He wanted to do the right thing. He was using his own personal resources, both financial and otherwise, to try and make change. I was deep enough into the state to understand the real significance of what the chief counsel's role was, and I really couldn't turn it down.
It's interesting that the chief counsel has played a lot of different roles in a lot of different administrations. I can remember back to, I'd say certainly the Hughes administration, the Cahill administration, maybe even the early days of the Byrne administration. That the counsel's office was often sort of the point person on legislation. Then it began to move more toward legal stuff, just, straight legal. Not that you wouldn't also be called upon as a policy advisor, but it was primarily, it moved toward reviewing regulations, reviewing legislation, making sure that it's constitutional, that it passed muster, that it doesn't conflict with another piece of legislation, appointments to the bench, these sorts of things. How much did you feel you were involved in policy development from that position?
Somewhere in the middle of all of this. I think, by the time I came aboard, and I should say that for better or for worse, I'm not sure it was for better, I'd only been in the state at this point for 9 or 10 years, if that much. So I didn't have much of the history. Ed McBride, who succeeded me, fortunately, actually, with the benefit of Eagleton, was deeply versed in the history of state government. So I didn't really have as much of the, context for this. But to directly answer your question, I think the modern evolution of the governor's office and how it's created has almost always had tension between the policy office and the counsel's office.
Absolutely.
And Heather Howard, who was there, who I consider a friend, and I think we both were of good intent in this, which is important. I mean, I think we sort of liked and trusted each other. I think she was a little concerned when I was hired because I came out of a policy side, not a legal side.
But a very progressive policy side.
Absolutely.
And one that I would have thought that most of the people surrounding Corzine would have embraced.
Oh, absolutely. No, I mean, I don't think I'm talking now just from an institutional perspective.
Okay.
That, I mean, I came into that position because of my expertise as a policy person, as much as a lawyer, right?
Well, except the background that we spent a lot of time talking about to get to this point. Obviously, you were well versed in law.
Absolutely.
And
so, all to say though, the answer was some. The way in which the position. I mean, I think there were two dynamics. One was that. It was a very good staff. The details of the legislation, which is what staff, were reviewing, got to policy issues, and I and the team were at a table whenever those would be debated at the end of the day. I think the other pieces that Stu, in terms of the role that he had taken on in the relatively short period of time he was there, had focused more on the legal side. I mean, he was so clearly armed by John to be the leader in the anti-corruption face of the administration. I mean, in perfect sense, that's where he was coming from. Right. The standard joke I always heard is that half the legislators wouldn't talk to them because they were afraid he was wired, and they sure as hell had no idea what to make out of for me. I mean, talk about non-traditional counsel types.
Well, your only experience up to that point with legislators probably was with the urban legislators and the Hispanic caucus.
No, I mean, I negotiated on the predatory lending legislation. I had spent a lot of time, and look, to get legislation passed, you got to talk to everybody. And I'd been fairly good about crossing the aisle, about recognizing whether it was Vitale or whether it was Kane or,
So you had established relationships with a number of legislators.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, I wasn't, I had some.
But were you called upon to actually lobby legislators
Certainly.
On certain legislative issues?
When I was in the council?
Yes.
Oh, absolutely. No, I remember, a budget thing where, John said, okay, time to hold it. I ended up with responsibility for a period of time for Camden. And Patty, who you referenced,
McGuire,
was certainly my rabbi in terms of introducing me to the legislatures at that level. But and then because I had responsibility for appointments, particularly prosecutors and judges, I got to know the legislators
I bet you did.
quite well. So, and those were just amazing experiences.
Oh, I can imagine. How close of a day-to-day relationship did you have with the governor directly, as opposed to members of his staff?
I mean, it's going back a little bit, but I would think it would be an unusual day where I wouldn't talk to him.
No.
I mean, there were we had staff meetings 3 times a week, and he was almost always there. I think, one of the things I respected about him is that he took the responsibility seriously. If anything, he may have been too involved in detail at the end of the day, but, so he was more present than I've seen other principals in those kinds of jobs.
And who else was involved in the 3 times a week staff meeting?
I mean, they were. If John wasn't there, Tom Shea, the chief of staff, would run it.
Right.
But Maggie Moran, Patty,
Janine LaRue.
Patty,
So the three
deputies would all be there. Heather Howard, me as chief counsel. Sometimes Ed McBride, my deputy, would come aboard. But that was sort of the heart of it.
That was the core.
The communications. I'm blanking on his name,
I am
Anthony
too.
Coley.
Coley, right.
Would be there. So, it was sort of effectively the leadership team.
Right.
But, in terms of roles, and they evolved over time. I mean, it was not, shall we say, I think, always the organizationally clear,
It never is.
but, because in one of my most significant roles was to get him to sign the legislation. It meant when we were ready or there was a deadline, finding him, briefing him on the legislation, whether we wanted to line item veto, or sign.
That must have been particularly an issue in that first budget.
Oh, well, I wasn't, the first budget.
Oh, that's right,
Stu
yeah. You came
done.
after the shutdown.
I came after the
Okay.
shutdown. And then, the complexity occurred when the accident happened,
Oh, yeah.
right? So I was there for that.
April 2007.
Right. So all of a sudden, we go from the guy that has hired us to going to work for the person who had not hired us. So I'll leave it there for the time being.
Okay.
But it's the most remarkable thing I've ever gone through, where all of a sudden somebody who had been, it's the same party, but had very different views.
Mm-hmm.
On some level was the person that we had to figure out how to navigate. All of a sudden becomes our boss for an undetermined period of time.
Right.
It makes no sense in any rational way of thinking about how government should operate, that would be what you do. It just
Well, that's why we now have a lieutenant governor.
absolutely, and I can happily testify to the value of that.
Yeah. Was it because of mixed signals, or was it just because you're functionally leaderless?
Oh, well, you mean what makes it difficult in that period of time?
Well, obviously the emotional attachment
Right.
that you have to the governor. But it's very interesting. We've done a number of these interviews now and talked specifically about what happened after the accident. We've gotten some very, very different viewpoints regarding whether Senator Cody, then acting Governor Cody, took the helm and had a seamless relationship with the front office, or whether specifically the chief of staff and the immediate staff of the governor took control and was less than inclined to give the acting governor his due.
So, that's fascinating. This actually is probably worth the effort that's being taken, because I do think it's a case study.
Oh, I think it really is. And it's interesting that we get such a divergent set of views on
Right.
it.
So, on some level, I think it turns on how policy-driven versus how politically driven the staff person is. To me, the most legitimate reason for there to be conflict is the absence of knowledge of how long this is going to be, right? So I think for the acting governor, he's supposed to step in. He's got a responsibility to take this on. And on day-to-day matters, right, I think it was very appropriate, and we tried, or at least I recall trying to defer to him on those. The hard part, though, is that, a governor's reputation isn't made by the day-to-day. It's made by the 3 or 4 things that are going to be legacy issues. And on those, whether it was, asset monetization or labor negotiations, those things Dakota had very different views on. And so the question as a senior staff person about what you're supposed to do when you know the person who hired you is going to be coming back, how do you manage your responsibility to the acting governor who's in charge of the state constitutionally? He has the responsibility about something that's not going to be decided on his watch, and yet he's responsible. And there are no answers to that question. That's why having a lieutenant governor is so important. That's just how the institutional setup creates that tension. I think beyond that, though, I think there were some, it's personally a very difficult thing. Frankly, we didn't know if Corzine was going to survive.
Yeah.
And once we saw, what he did to recover is just beyond belief. And I don't think people fully appreciate just both how injured he was and what it meant for him to work as hard as he did to be able to get back in the saddle. But I remember it being tense, and I also remember it being very difficult to know. I don't think it's any secret that the chief of staff's relationship with the acting governor was not a good one. Huge tensions. Therefore, what did it mean? Were we supposed to be a team that was remaining intact? Was it something in which, the complexities of a front office, which always exist, were going to somehow, lead us to have very different relationships with him? He had his own staff that he certainly called on, and it was as complicated a situation as I've ever been in.
Do you feel as though you had a good relationship with Senator Cody, with acting Governor Cody, with Governor Cody?
I don't think so. I respect him, very highly, but I found it really tough to do. And in part, there was probably some loyalty to John that I felt, but it was also that, I was hired by a governor because of a certain approach that I had that was very, very different than what, the acting governor did. Dick is somebody who knows the legislative process inside and out. He knows what he wants to get out of it. He's interested and makes judgments pretty quickly. John's approach is just very different. It's, very policy driven. It's very much about sort of trying to get to the image of what you want to get to, and then you figure out how far you can get. And those are two very different ways of approaching issues. And it's made me deeply appreciate why everybody should have their own staff.
One of the criticisms that we've heard of Governor Corzine is what you just described. Having a sort of a broad, overarching vision of what he wants to see happen, but having difficulty getting there for a variety of reasons. The accident clearly was one. Toward the end of his administration, the financial crisis would have been another. But particularly on something as complicated as asset monetization, it seems as though there was just a failure to adequately explain what it was all about, starting with the governor and with all the surrogates who went out and talked about it, who really evidently either didn't understand it or hadn't done the groundwork that was necessary to get any kind of support for it legislatively. Would that be an accurate assessment?
I'd agree with that. The nuance I would add, well, the first thing I would say, I think people continually underestimate the significance of the accident politically. Politics is sort of like the shark, right? Unless you're moving forward, you're moving backwards or dying. And when the accident occurs, it meant he was just out of commission. And even worse, it was happening in his second year. I believe pretty strongly that talented people who haven't lived in politics, they're going to make their biggest mark. Certainly coming out of the gate, but that second year is absolutely critical. They've actually started to figure out what it looks like. They've started to apply their own personal views of what they can do, what they can't do. And so in that second year, they're sort of coming to fruition with enough momentum from election and now enough knowledge about what works. So that second year, and he was deprived of that. And so I just wanted to add that as something that I think is a much more significant factor in things that didn't work than is sort of publicly acknowledged.
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation.
That said, I do think in terms of John, part of what I really like and respect about him is that he is not an egomaniac. And frankly, I think in politics, there's a degree of egomania you need. So fairly frequently, he would say, we, right? We don't need to look to DC to see that, politicians don't frequently say we. There's a politician in DC right now who says I all the time. But for John, it meant it was really hard, I think, for him, because he's sort of a team person, to say, I believe X, as opposed to making it seem like something that's more of a collective vision. And I think that's dangerous in politics. People need to feel that they can connect with you. And if you're not saying this is me who's doing it, and I do deeply respect him, but I don't think he was a particularly effective communicator for things that he cared most about. Asset monetization. I still remember this conversation. Brad Abelow, the treasurer, was there. Well, he was still treasurer. Maggie was there. And we were talking about what we should call this thing. And I think John was the one who said, well, let's call it asset monetization, a phrase that everybody understands. And at that point, I felt like, oh shit, okay, we are in some deep trouble. And it was just, I mean...
Maybe the communications person should have been in on that meeting as well.
It may have been. But I do think that kind of... And it's not because John was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, because he was not.
No, understood.
In no way, shape, or form. But, you know, unfortunately, that kind of ability to be pithy, that ability to communicate very directly in ways people understand, you know, his successor was somebody who had that particular skill set, and it's a valuable one to have.
Yeah. It's been suggested to us that he was more temperamentally suited to be United States Senator than he was to be governor. Would you agree with that?
I mean, I do think there are people who are much more suited to be, you know, legislators than executives. And frankly, I think it's very interesting to think about Senator Booker and ask the same question about him. So I understand why people say that. The hesitation I have is that, you know, John loves digging into the details of issues. And there's something really valuable about an executive with his breadth of experience. You know, that said, though, there's no question that, you know, that communication piece we just talked about is so vital to have as an executive that I think it does complicate it. And the other piece, and this is, it's hard for me to say because I believe legislation or government is complicated, and complexity is recognizing complexity is a really important part of being an effective public servant. But you need to be able to have an overarching vision of what's most important to you, to say these are the 3 or 4 things that matter, and say I'm going to ignore the rest of it. And I think that's really hard for somebody who's got as much appreciation for complexity as he does.
Let's talk about 2 or 3 of the major issues that confronted the administration. The death penalty. You must have been involved in that.
I was deeply involved in that.
And was this from a legal point of view, how it's crafting the legislation and assuring that it would pass constitutional muster, or was it lobbying the legislature? How did you go about doing
well,
this?
I'll tell you, I should say though, I mean, one of the fascinating things about the chief counsel job is, you know, it's like those job positions where they give you 6 different things and they say duties not yet assigned, and that's what fills up one's time. I mean, I was in the middle of the email controversy with the emails between Carla Katz and John Corzine. You know, created a special commission.
And that ended up actually going to court, didn't
Absolutely.
It? Yeah.
So, I mean, whoever anticipates that.
And that's the crisis of the day as opposed to the...
Or month or year, as the case may be. But then there's UMD&J, which maybe we'll come back to. So, you know, because in New Jersey, the chief counsel's position has, you know, the boards and authorities under it, it means that in addition to the appointments, you've got huge both authority but legislative interest in those things that are sort of off the legislative screen. And that was something that surprised me. I thought it was one of the more interesting aspects of the job, that there were all these other things that were really important nobody knows about, but for those who do know about them, they're really interesting.
So for example, whether the governor should approve or veto the minutes of the Turnpike Authority?
Oh, absolutely.
I see.
You know, and the Port Authority is the biggest
one,
of these. But so with the death penalty, you know, this was an issue that I knew something about. But it's an example, I think, of the best kind of government activity, as opposed to simply saying, and John believed in this. This was just something that was a matter of pure principle on his part. But you're not going to get anywhere unless you prepare in some way the legislature and the public for what you're going to do. And so I think it occurred before I came aboard, but there had been a commission, the Death Penalty Moratorium Commission, established. And I ended up being the chief liaison for that. Similarly, like on the Turnpike Racial Profiling Commission. There were multiple things that were high profile of that kind where that was something I was charged with engaging in. They're not really legislation per se, but they're going to matter. And with the death penalty, Reverend Bill Howard, remarkable man who was the chair of it, and we had to work pretty hard because that was going to be the basis. What they came out with in their recommendation with the death penalty was going to be the public voice that was going to establish it. And
you also had some outspoken proponents in the legislature who had been pushing this for years.
Absolutely.
That probably helped as well.
Well, it did, except that, not except. So, there were the allies that were there, even though, as you know, when the legislation was signed, neither the Senate Majority Leader nor the Assembly Leader showed up for it, right? So there was deep ambivalence in the legislature at the same time. But what one needed to politically get there for the legislature was for this commission that included prosecutors, it included victims, those who would be inclined to oppose it, to be part of something where you could say, the world has now changed enough that even those who are opposed to or were in favor of the death penalty believe in New Jersey it no longer makes sense. And it was only by having the commission do that you could get there. Now, trying to get prosecutors, we appointed the prosecutors, and while we couldn't and wouldn't tell them what to do, there were a couple visits that were made to make sure they were understood the perspective the governor had on this, and the Prosecutors Association ended up coming out neutral on it, which felt like the right outcome. And then there were things, by far the most difficult meeting I have ever taken in my entire life was a meeting of the victims of those who have been murdered, whose murderers are sitting on death row. And there's certain things you do in government that you will never forget. But this is a meeting where you have to give them all the respect that their losses require, and there's absolutely nothing you can say. And and it was a 2-hour meeting where, you're not going to argue policy with them, but it was the kind of thing that one needs to do because it's the right thing to do, and it's also politically something that you need to say that you have done. And so, ultimately, the committee report comes out. It explains how the length of time it takes means that even those victims who are in favor of it no longer feel like it serves a purpose, and that with that report we could then begin the legislative process to move toward abolition. And it budget, and there's lots of negotiations. I remember with I'm blanking on her name. She's my state senator in Montclair.
Geez, I'm so out of it these days I wouldn't know.
Well, that's awful. At any rate, I remember negotiations with individuals to get them there. Senator Cody released Nia Gill.
Okay.
That released them from having to vote the caucus line, but it was coming down to the wire, and ultimately we got one vote we needed and got the majority. The piece, though, that I remember, which is a great story. So legislation is passed, I think, on Thursday. It's a very short time. We decide we're going to sign it on Monday. And two things occur between that Thursday and that Monday. The first is a legal question, which is all of a sudden we realize, or I think they'd anticipated it, there were 8 people on death row. And what happens when you legislatively abolish it, you go back to the sentence that was in effect, that was the next most severe sentence. And for some of these people, those sentences were ones that could have led them to be paroled. And we had made the commitment that we would not parole anybody who was on death row, that they would continue serving the remainder of their terms in prison.
And was that specified in the legislation?
I can't remember, but what we had to investigate was whether you could commute somebody's sentence to a sentence that did not exist when they were sentenced. In other words,
life in prison without parole.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, it was one of those only in government last minute things, a lot of time with Ann Milgram, who was the Attorney General, and concluded that we could. So that before he signed, we commuted those 8 sentences
You
to
would
life
certainly
without parole.
not have any difficulty arguing legislative intent on an issue like that.
No, but appropriately, the defender, the public defense bar would litigate all of this, and there's a good legal case to be made that you're making it up. You're actually violating your constitutional authority by creating a law that was never enacted.
Right.
So that was one thing that occurred, and it's an example of the really fascinating legal issues that emerged. But the others, I'm sitting in my office on Friday before the Monday signing. My assistant comes in and said, "You got a call from the Vatican." I said, "Excuse me?" And I said, "Okay, I mean, what do they want?" She said, "I don't know." I said, "I'll take this call, right?" And why they found the Jewish guy is still one of those questions. But they say, "Would you have any objection if on Monday, when the governor signs this law, we light up the Roman Colosseum?" It's something we do whenever we think there's something that's advancing the sanctity of life around the world, and we believe the legislative abolition of the death penalty in New Jersey is worthy of that.
I hope you went straight to the communications people and said, "Blast this all over the papers this weekend."
Yeah, I mean, it's just, it's like one of those really remarkable things.
Yeah.
And one of the great mementos I have is a copy of the signed bill and the Coliseum above it lit up
nice.
from this. But it was a reflection of, I think, the significance of that signing.
Let's talk about public school financing. This is an area in which I recall, due diligence or full disclosure here, I was in the front office or the policy office in Governor Florio's administration during the first year when every 5 minutes there was another ream of paper looking at how the Quality Education Act that was being formulated would affect this district or that district, and whether it would meet the Abbott versus Burke, well, originally Robinson versus Cahill and Abbott versus Burke, and what extraordinary effort went into just creating that formula. How involved were you in either the creation of the formula or in considering the questions of whether this would meet the Supreme Court's decisions, previous decisions in Abbott, of whether it was providing the thorough and efficient system that the Constitution requires?
So I was actively involved at the table. It was interesting as a matter sort of a public policy development, though. This is one where the complexity of the issue and John's orientation toward getting the policy right meant that there were more people involved than might otherwise be the case. And so, in particular, if you've talked to the Commissioner of Education, Lucille Davey, I'm sure she educated you on the intense and lengthy efforts, including going back to the drawing board with a couple of things that did not work. And then the Attorney General's office, and the significance that Anne herself argued this in front of the Supreme Court meant that she herself, as well as Bob, wonderful guy who's now an appellate court judge, were actively involved in this. So, I was Ed McBride, and then the woman we had who was our counsel on education, but it was a big team that was involved in it, and Heather as well. So, this is one of those times where I think appropriately it is a legacy issue, so you need both those who are deep in the weeds and then trying to ensure that you're getting it up to the right level where the strategic question is being called.
Was the issue of whether it would or would not meet the court's mandate, was that directed primarily to you or primarily to Ann Ogrum?
I think it was a combination. Probably though Ann on something like that. I think in this case it was something where the AG's office had to give us their first assessment. And I don't remember being asked. I remember being involved in the phone calls, but not giving an independent judgment.
What's the functional difference between the Attorney General and the Chief Counsel?
It's pivotal, and unfortunately, at the federal level, we're starting to see the significance of it. The Chief Counsel, just like the White House counsel, represents the office of the governor, and so in any well-run administration, the Attorney General is the counsel for the state. And so, you should always have a collaborative relationship, but it meant that, in conceptual terms, there would be times where it was entirely appropriate for me as chief counsel to be very attentive to political concerns, never compromise what was legal or not, but in making choices about strategy to say, this just doesn't rise to that level, and among the legal options that are available, we should take this into account to make a decision. And that's about how the governor is going to further what he believes are his interests. All within the constraints of what's legal. The Attorney General's responsibilities are not to take that into account. They should be calling the shots as a lawyer, going forward. So there would be times, for example, most obviously in criminal prosecutions, where the Attorney General should not tell us about the status of a criminal prosecution. It's what we're seeing in the federal level right now, where that's the independence of the criminal function. I would be on the phone daily, if not more, with Ann or Bob, or Stu when he was there, just because the issues overlapped sufficiently, and we would rely on the Attorney General's office, very, very heavily for almost anything that required in-depth legal research, because it was far beyond the resources we had, but there were different functions, and occasionally they could come into tension.
Was marriage equality an issue while you were there?
Absolutely.
And then that one must have required a bit of legal, you needed legal justification for, right?
Well, so the issue that came up, the civil union case, was decided. And by the way, just as an aside, one of the great experiences that, as a courtesy, the court gives the chief counsel the decision an hour before they formally release it. And so Justice Portz, who I've got great respect for, calls over, says it's coming. And you can't release it, obviously, but you have a team now.
Did you tell you what it was?
No.
Oh,
you're just sending it over.
Coming.
But you have an hour then so that you can be prepared when the decision is released. Which is partly communications, but partly it's legal at the end of the day. And so, in the aftermath of that, there's both a communications function. What is the position that's being taken? I remember calling the governor, and he was on the elliptical trainer and whatever gym he was at the time.
I know where it was, in the Princeton Shopping Center.
Yeah, and updating him on him, and suggesting a response and indicating it was. We were supportive of the decision, but just as importantly, then you had to begin to transition to how you were going to implement it. And this is an example of a function one would never think about. You have to start then identifying each and every area in which you now need to change operations to allow people who participate in civil unions to have the same rights as married couples do.
And does that require legislation, or is that's just an automatic? It's a given.
Well, this is the classic thing. It's now constitutionally required, but to do it requires a huge amount of work. You have to go into the law. You have to look at every cabinet agency has to examine.
Oh, I see. Within government itself.
Absolutely. If somebody's applying for benefits, are you asking, are you married or not? Are you excluding people who would be entitled to this benefit? And so there's an implementation function that's huge.
That's very interesting. UMD&J, you
Yes.
had mentioned that. I think it's the first time that actually that's come up in
Is that
any
right?
of these conversations. And I thought that had been largely settled by the time you got there, but no, that was continuing?
No, I spent a bunch of time. So, this is an example.
Why don't you explain what was going on?
So, University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey, State Medical and Dental School. It's a state institution, and the U.S. Attorney, U.S. Attorney Christie had gone after it appropriately and found a degree of corruption at the fairly high levels, and had engaged ultimately in a non-prosecution agreement that required sort of wholesale reforms, including a degree of monitoring by the U.S. Attorney's Office that was significant. There were real wrongs underlying it. Even though it was also clear over time that the U.S. Attorney believed that publicizing the wrongs were a very important piece of this. And I think, if I had to look at an example of why I think Governor Corzine's legacy should be rosier than perhaps it will be, it was because he was willing to invest time and effort in something like this. There is no upside politically to having a deeply tarnished institution to spend political capital. Most politicians would do what they need to do to, get it off the headlines and be done. Instead, he actually said, no, let's see if we can turn the institution around, and it begins with leadership. And the only way you're going to get somebody to go on a board of an institution that is in such trouble is if the governor is willing to make personal calls. And he started off by asking Bob Del Tufo, former U.S. Attorney himself, former Attorney General, to serve as the board chair. He had former president of Princeton, Harold Shapiro, agree to join the board and put together a blue ribbon board of people who were going to be involved in the turnaround. Now, this is the kind of thing, I've got some responsibility as chief counsel and dealing with the U.S. Attorney's Office. I remember a meeting with Chris Christie, Stu and I, as my introduction to Chris Christie along the way. And it was a very difficult thing. There was legal liability. The U.S. Attorney was determined to keep this in the press. But he invested, and I invested, a ton of time in really supporting, which was supporting the turnaround. And it required nothing that was ever going to be publicly recognized, but because it was the right thing to do and it was an important thing to do.
You clearly admire John Corzine's ability to, not necessarily, I don't want to say get down in the weeds, but to analyze and be interested in the whole gamut of issues that surrounded him. And he obviously conveyed that. That comes through in every one of the interviews that we've done. His personal attention and interest in the variety of areas that you all were involved in. Somehow that did not penetrate publicly. Some people say that he lost re-election because the economy went tanked, and that he otherwise might have won. But others have suggested, and I think we've talked a little bit about this so far, that that the warmth that you all felt toward him did not correspond to a warmth that the electorate felt about him.
So I've got deep respect for that, desire to get into the weeds, as you say. I don't know how to judge whether it's possible to be a political leader and have that or follow through on that instinct. I actually think it's a complicated, the challenge is weeds aren't what the public is looking for. And the public wants to feel that there's a leader that they trust and who is making things happen that are important. And as you know as well as anybody, unfortunately the public is not deeply informed about many things, including many of these weeds. So, to work for somebody who cared about government was really the sensibility and cared about government serving its purpose, creating a level playing field, advancing opportunity for people who wouldn't otherwise get it, having a long-term vision about how the state was going to be better. The idea that those were core to him and he wanted those is the thing that I have the deepest respect for him for. And it was because the things I've mentioned were aligned with that I've got such, I speak about them warmly, UMDNJ, the death penalty. I think these are all consistent with those principles. I was frustrated by him in the sense that I think he had a tough time differentiating between what his role needed to be and things only he could do, and how to delegate sufficiently so that he could create a team that would be empowered to take care of the rest of it without him needing to be involved. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, as a political leader, he's the leader. He's the one elected. He's the one who's put his name and head out there. And I think that when that happens, that's the person that, gets to make these calls. But I think there were times where, again, the hypothetical if there hadn't been an accident, and how things would have emerged for him is what I really wonder about sometimes, because I think that learning curve was really being developed right at the time when it was interrupted by the accident.
What happened in you left the position in 2008?
I did.
At the end of the year?
No, it was, I think, earlier in the year.
Okay.
Were you
burned out?
I was somewhat burned out. I had kids who were getting ready to go to college, and I got an offer from Lowenstein Sandler to be what is arguably the best private sector gig one can have, which is
Pro
to be
bono, right?
the partner in charge of just doing do-good stuff.
Yeah.
So,
explain what that is.
Yeah. I will tell you one more story that I've always wanted to get in before we completely leave the Chief Counsel. So, pro bono in the legal world means providing legal services free of charge, and the law as a profession holds itself up to having responsibility for the public. So there's an expectation that every lawyer should provide free legal services. While that's been done over the past 20 or 25 years, it's been a really interesting development where large firms have started to realize that they should do this in a more systematic way. Just as an aside, there's this fascinating history where the American Lawyer, the journal that provides a ranking of law firms every year, the top 20 law firms, to their credit, when they identified the criteria they would use, included commitment to pro bono as one of the 4 or 5 major criteria they would use. And there would be some cynics who would just note that the law firm commitment to pro bono might coincide with the way in which the rankings were calculated. I'm not saying I'm that kind of cynic, but there might be some who would point that out. But over this time, law firms who have enormous wealth and enormous resources have created these full-time positions and units within the law firm exclusively focused on how to deploy lawyers to do pro bono work. And so,
do you choose the cases?
Yeah, so when I joined Lowenstein
clients?
Sandler, the firm had been doing enormous amounts of pro bono work. It's always, there's a ranking in New Jersey that comes out with, and Lowenstein had always been number 1 or number 2 with Gibbons. But what they realized is that doing it sort of in an ad hoc manner probably didn't fully provide the level of impact that they wanted. It probably didn't provide some of the ancillary benefits, legal training, working with clients that pro bono work can do. And so, I came aboard and I knew enough to start really trying to focus the efforts in ways that could make it a coherent program. And we did amicus work in the U.S. Supreme Court on criminal justice reform. We got corporate attorneys involved as the foreclosure crisis played out and working out better ways to do, foreclosure workouts. We got very involved in immigration. But by sustaining it and having an infrastructure inside the firm, we could do more than sort of an ad hoc process otherwise could.
And do you continue in that capacity to this day?
No. So I spent 5 years or so at Lowenstein.
And then came Soros.
And then I got the remarkable
fascinating job.
As heading up George Soros's domestic foundation. And I left that last year, but I was there for the 6 years.
Okay. Yeah, that's where your resume online ended.
Okay.
So I wasn't sure when that happened.
And so, I should say that while I was at the firm, it was during 2008 when Obama got elected, and one of the things I did, I was asked to join the Obama transition team. And so I spent actually 3 months on loan from the firm to the transition, and then I spent another 8 months sort of both at the firm and then serving as a senior advisor to the HUD secretary, Sean Donovan. So, so I went to work for George, and first of all, I will say after being in politics, handing out money makes you immediately funnier, better looking, and smarter than I've ever been before in my life. But it's fascinating. On some level, I view it as the continuity it's about strategic deployment of the assets that you have. And, we were involved in the same types of issues, from criminal justice reform to economic advancement to racial justice, that I'd been doing in a variety of other capacities, but just now a new way of doing it.
And the primary responsibility is to identify and have programs I assume there's a whole bunch of program officers who work with.
Yeah, so I was overseeing a staff of about 70 and passing out about $125 million a year, which is enough to make you popular in lots of circles.
Yeah, absolutely. And you didn't have to fundraise.
I didn't have to fundraise, even though it's ironic because part of the role, it sounds bizarre, but I thought my fundraising days were over, but it turns out that a lot of what I was doing was working with other foundations to get agreement. So, you know, there were 6 foundations that were putting $80 million a year into state and local, progressive reform. Trying to coordinate and bring them together was significant. Some of the major Obama initiatives around DACA, for example, we were doing outside funding that were complementing what the administration was doing inside. So, at my level, most of it wasn't responding. We were trying to say, okay, strategically, what are the 4 or 5 most important things that we should be doing on a multi-year level? And then when things upended, like the election of 2016, how do we respond? So as an example, after the 2016 election, and obviously while we had both a C3 capacity and a C4 capacity, meaning the C4 stuff can get you involved in legislative and political work.
We need to explain 501c3 is a philanthropy.
Right.
501c4 means that you can actually get involved politically.
Right. And while we didn't do George Soros's personal political work, and so he invested, for example, in electing progressive prosecutors, we could get involved, for example, in running ballot initiatives or to abolish the death penalty in California or a variety of other things. But in the immediate aftermath of the election, George calls me up on a Saturday and says, I think we should do something showing that communities around the country are really opposed to the rhetoric of this president. Can you get me a $10 million plan by Tuesday? There's something that is different in private philanthropy than the way government allocates money, I should say. But it was great. We created something called Communities Against Hate, which was an open RFP that allowed any community in the country that wanted to do something to stand up for those who were being marginalized.
Signs in people's front yards that
absolutely.
Reflect that. Yeah.
And so, overwhelmed by the response. And it was another part of looking at the way in which government.
And it didn't bother you that George Soros is the devil incarnate to the right wing?
That didn't bother me, even though it was interesting to be personally featured on a couple of the websites that.
Oh, is that right? You've been targeted too?
But it's a reminder in a way, in some of what we've talked about with John Corzine, the way in which public image doesn't correspond to, people in the limelight is as true with George as it is with John. And, it's just fascinating that George Soros is a little bit horrified to be viewed as a political animal in the way that he is. He's got a deep philosophy of what one does to build a society to advance human dignity, that's about open discussion, that's about debate, and conditions don't always support that kind of thing.
I know you're teaching.
I am.
At NYU?
I am.
And is that your full-time gig now?
It's not my full-time gig. I'm teaching, I'm writing some, I'm doing a bunch of consulting with philanthropists and foundations and a variety of issues from student voting to mental health in jails. And on a personal level, it's been a complicated time for my family. We lost a child, which is a very, very difficult thing. So it was part of what led me to leave OSF when I did. Unfortunately, the family is coming back. But I've enjoyed the academic piece and continue finding ways to contribute and look forward to continuing to do so.
Well, you've certainly contributed to the archive that we're putting together on Governor Corzine, and we thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Great.
All right.
There was one story you said.
Oh,
yeah, you were going to tell a story.
So let me tell my one story just because it's a great you should. Yeah. It's a great New Jersey politics story. So when I was chief counsel, one of my responsibilities obviously was appointing or having the governor nominate judges as well as prosecutors. And I was very proud of the work we did, the first African American in Morris County. We spent a lot of time focused on diversity. But at any rate, the way it works is the same way the federal government works, as you know, in that it's an advise and consent system, which means the Senate takes the advise and consent phrase, meaning it thinks it has the power, while the governor thinks the governor has the power, and therefore there's always a tussle. But it means
And there's also the senatorial courtesy in the Senate.
Absolutely.
Which is really
Same blue slip process where each home district senator believes, and as a matter of practice, is given the authority to say they will only go forward if that person is behind it. Anyway, there was a senator who I won't name in Ocean County who came to me, as they did, and said, look, I've got somebody I'd like you to consider. So I say, of course, Senator, we'll take him. We start investigating him and conclude that the levels of racial tolerance and support that we were interested this particular candidate didn't meet. And so I go back to the senator and say, Senator, I'm sorry, we'd be happy to look at any other names you want to give us, but this particular candidate isn't one that we're comfortable moving forward, and give a somewhat diplomatic explanation of it. So, the senator's not pleased with any of this. But one day I'm sitting in my office and my assistant comes in and says, there's this guy, Ernest Biner, on the phone who wants to talk to you. Now, if you're a football fan, you'll remember Ernest Biner had been a famous running back for both the Cleveland Browns and then subsequently for the Washington football team. And somehow they had figured out that I was from Washington, that I was a fan of the Washington football team, and that perhaps if I talked to this guy...
You refuse to call them the Redskins?
I do.
Okay,
I do.
good. I thought so.
That if I talked to him, that might impress me. So I take the call, in part because it would make a good story. And Ernest Biner says he happened to know the candidate that we had rejected from the Union County senator. And he just wanted
Ocean
County. I'm sorry,
okay.
I said Ocean County. That the Ocean County candidate, Ernest Biner knew, and he wanted to say he was a good guy, and therefore I should agree to let him move forward. And I hung up, and afterwards I tried to figure out exactly how I should respond to this. Should I be offended that the price they think that will lead me to change my mind would be a phone call from a childhood football hero, or not? Whatever it is, I was so impressed that they went to that level of research to figure out what might be influential to me. But I thought it was also a great indication of New Jersey politics.
Oh, absolutely. It's a perfect New Jersey politics story.